Israel has been accused of stealing the land of the Palestinians in order to create the state of Israel in 1948, assuming that there is Palestinian sovereignty over this land beforehand. Nothing can be further from the truth. Let's explore it. Shalom, my friends. This is Akiva Gersh with Israel in 5, where we give you everything Israel in 5 minutes. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, want to keep the conversation going, please do so below in the comments. The classic conversation for years now is that the state of Israel was built on top of the state of Palestine, and that the Jews stole the land of the Palestinians in order to create the state of Israel in 1948, assuming that there's Palestinian sovereignty over this land. Again, nothing can be further from the truth when you look into the history. You look in the history books, which is clear, accessible to all of us. There's never been a Palestinian state in this land. What has there been? There has been the coming and going of empires, empire after empire after empire, stretching back thousands of years. In more recent years, the Ottoman Empire, starting in the 1500s, controlled this land for 400 years, up until the end of World War I. After World War I, they lost most of their land, and the Middle East was reborn, was redrawn by the powers that defeated the Ottoman Empire in World War I. New countries were formed, like Jordan and Syria, Lebanon and Iraq. And next to all of those was the newly born Jewish state, a state that was promised to the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration of 1920. So what happens? After World War I, the Ottomans lose this land, and the land is broken up into different, what's called mandates, different pieces of land that are going to be overseen by either the British or the French until the people living there on the ground could get themselves together and can create their own independent country. The French controlled the land that would eventually become Lebanon and Syria, and the British controlled the land that would eventually become Iraq and Jordan. And what was to be with Palestine? Let's first discuss for a moment, why was it called Palestine? This was a name that was used in ancient times by the Romans, but there was a more ancient name to this land. That was Judea, Samaria, Israel. Right? The Romans changed the name of this land after they conquered it almost 2,000 years ago in order to attempt to try to erase the Jewish history from this land. Sound familiar? People are trying to do the same exact thing in modern day times. So modern day countries use this name that was on the books, in the history books, Palestine, and they use it to describe this land. That wasn't to say that this was a state of Palestine. That's not to say that there was a country of Palestine. It was called the Mandate of Palestine, given to the British after World War I. And why was it given to the British? In order to oversee the terms of the Balfour Declaration, as was written in a legal document of the League of Nations, and to oversee the establishment and the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. There was no talk of a Palestinian state. There was no talk of a Palestinian people. There were Arabs living here, of course. There were a few 100,000 Arabs here living here towards the beginning years of Zionism. And just like the Jewish population grew, their population grew as well. But again, number one, there was never a Palestinian state here in the past. There were empires. Before the Ottoman Empire, there were other empires, right? Stretching all the way back to the Roman Empire, before them, the Greek Empire, and so on and so forth, right? And in modern day times, when the Middle East was sectioned off and new countries were formed, there was no talk of a Palestinian state. There was talk of a Jewish national home, a Jewish state, right? In the land that was the Mandate of Palestine. And of course, recognizing that there are non-Jews living in this land and their rights should be fully protected, which of course the state of Israel agreed to and wrote into its own Declaration of Independence, that everyone would be free here, everyone would be able to practice their religion, their faith, and would be protected by law. So where did this idea then come from of the establishment of a Palestinian state? Before 1948, right, during the years of the British Mandate, chaos broke out, because there were waves and waves and waves of Arab riots against the Jews. This was pre-1948, between the years 1920 and 1948, out of protest of Zionism, out of protest of the Zionist movement and desire to create a Jewish state in the Mandate of Palestine. So they tried to stop it with violence in the 1920s and 1930s, multiple times in the 1930s and 1940s. There was violence against the Jews living here in order to try to stop them from creating their own state. Obviously, that didn't work. But what did happen is that the British were in control. Remember, they were the ones who were responsible for overseeing the creation of the Jewish state. They went against the terms of the League of Nations, okay, which was then adopted by the UN after World War II. And they sectioned off, they came up with a plan, a partition plan, to create two states for two people because they realized that the Jews and the Arabs are just not getting along here. This was not in line with the League of Nations. This shouldn't have happened according to the terms of the League of Nations document, but this is what the British did. And that plan did pass in the UN, but you know what? It had no legal weight. It passed in November 1947, the famous UN partition plan. That had no legal weight. Why? Because number one, the Arabs rejected it. So if you have two parties in a contract and one rejects it, so that contract has no legal weight. And the second reason why that had no legal weight is because it came out of the General Assembly and had the legal weight of a suggestion, of a recommendation, but could not be implemented neither by force or by economic sanctions. So therefore, there was no legality of the behind or towards the creation of a Palestinian state. And after the War of Independence in 1948, which stretched into 1949, that partition plan was not implemented. There were lands that Israel did not take over in that war, and those lands were gobbled up by neighboring Arab nations. Right? Egypt took over the Gaza Strip illegally. Jordan took over the lands of Judea and Samaria, called it West Bank illegally, and nobody said anything because they were being controlled by Arab countries. Only after 1967, when Israel, in defense of itself, took over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank out of the hands of the Egyptians and the Jordanians because they were attacking Israel with the desire, with the goal of destroying Israel, that's when the Palestinian national movement really, really takes off. Now that they're under Jewish rule, they want to fight for their rights. They want to fight for their own state. But again, it's so important to know that number one, no land was ever stolen by the Jews from the Palestinians. There were Arabs living in villages and communities on land that belonged to them. Jews bought land and built elsewhere, right, in the decades of the Zionist movement leading up to 1948. And again, there was no legality to the creation of a Palestinian state. There was no talk of the creation of a Palestinian state by the League of Nations after World War I, when there were countries being created, like, as we said, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. The only talk of the creation of an Arab state in Palestine, right, was in the UN partition plan, which again got thrown out to the wastebasket of history because it had no legality, and the Arabs rejected it anyway. Why? Because it included the creation of a Jewish state, which is something that they did not want, that they could not tolerate. So it's very, very important to know that, number one, there was no Palestinian state in this land ever in history. And number two, any talk of a modern Palestinian state was not rooted in international law. This land, literally from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, according to the terms, the very clear terms and the legal terms of the League of Nations, was supposed to only be one country, and that's the country of Israel. And this has confused people, and this has made this conflict even more complicated. It's important to know the history. It's important to know the facts. I hope that cleared things up for people. All the best and be well.